In the previous panels we looked at the Omek Hara component of the Negat Sarat that attacked the body. In this panel we shall be addressing the far more controversial assertion that embedded in the Negat Sarat there was an element of Riboy Hatov. Omek Hara, the negative side of the Sarat, is a belief statement. One either buys into the concept or one does not. To the God-centered individual, there is a recognition and acceptance of the Tsarat sickness. To the non-believer, we attribute the circumstances to genes, DNA, climate change, bad luck, without necessarily linking the disease to a Godhead. Riboy Hatov will prove to be far more difficult to defend. It will require a heavier dose of hashkafa, and as mentioned in the previous panel, hashkafa is subjective, limited in scope, and very often has one's agenda that informs the hashkafa position. Hence, the positions that will be proposed will be mine and mine alone, as I understand the texts. From what I gather from the Rebbe's SICHAH is that the Venatati Negat Sarat, the statement that God brings about a Negat Sarat, applies not only to the situation of the Tsarat in a building, but also to a Tsarat that attacks the body. This also comes from a decree from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and also reflects the Omek Hara situation. Two textual sources were brought to underpin the Omek Hara position, one from Sefer Yetzirah, a Kabbalistic document, the other from a commentary by Rashi to Vayikra 1346, drawn from the Gemara Masechet Pesachim, regarding the intensity of isolation meted out to one who has been afflicted with Negat Sarat and who is in the healing stage. To understand the Riboy Hatov component of a Negat Sarat, we might wish to refer to the Ani Ma'amim update listed in the Shabbos Blettel, a totally unauthorized source for Jewish hashkafa, but nevertheless some parts are sufficiently accurate and do reflect the thinking within the majority of Frum Orthodox of today. I refer to the statement that Ani Ma'amin Be'emunah Shleima, I have perfect faith and I accept that Shemi'ito Yitparech Lo Teitze Hara'ot. To the believer, attributing the good things that befall us to God's hashkacha is relatively easy, but then the thinking Frum Orthodox Jew needs to have in place a system for dealing with the negative events that happen throughout one's life. The concept of Hashem Echad mandates that the forces that underpin these negative outcomes also emanate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For without the concept of Hashem Echad, we enter into the realm of dualism, a God of good and a God of evil, which becomes far more problematic to monotheism. And hence, the lesser of the two evils is that Shemi'ito Yitparech Lo Teitze Hara'ot. Ra, bad, unfortunate events. Evil does not emanate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The flip side, short of accepting a God of good and a God of evil, we must also conclude that Ve'ein Shum Ra Ba'olam. Whatever happens, both good and bad, at its very core is not evil. V'hakol l'tova. If perceived evil or bad exist, there is a purpose for its existence. The Gam Zu L'Tova mindset, that ultimately everything is for the good. Hopefully we live long enough to appreciate that good. The problem with this position is that of justice. And just as in medicine, if it were the case that people who abuse their body in terms of food intake and lack of exercise invariably suffer a stroke and a heart attack, then one can relate the situation to a cause and effect series of events. But you do have exceptions to the rule. Somebody who is fit, exercises regularly, should not be a candidate for a heart attack, yet there have been some high-profile cases of such individuals suddenly dropping dead. Similarly, if the perceived Ra emanated from HaKadosh Baruch Hu was selective and impacted on people who deserved that Ra, then the concept would hold in terms of cause and effect. But the perennial question is, bad things, which we describe as Ra, do happen to good people. People who do not deserve the situation that they now face. It is at this juncture that possibly well-meaning but rather naive individuals very often step in and compound the pain of the tragedy by adopting and promoting a victim-blaming position in the defense of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is an approach that the Rebbe reads into the Rambam's position regarding the Neged Tzaraat, a position that I feel should only be undertaken by the individual, him or herself, who has been afflicted with the Neged Tzaraat or its modern counterpart. It is not a position to be imposed by others, as is unfortunately done in the world of pulpit rabbis and blogs. The statement of the Rambam we had mentioned in part 1 is where he steps back and adopts a holistic view of this entire topic of Neged Tzaraat, in which there is a progression. Contrary to the sequence recorded in the Torah, the Rambam suggests that the Neged Tzaraat worked in 3 stages. First, it attacked the buildings of an individual. Then, it moved closer to home, to the clothing of the individual. And finally, the Neged Tzaraat affected the actual body. The Rambam, the rationalist, the doctor, writes regarding the Neged Tzaraat that all 3 come about through the intercession of God. B'shutfot Hashem. It may or may not have been a bacteria, a virus, but ultimately this emanates from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and is eino min minhago shel olam. In its day, it was not a medical condition. Ela ot upele haya. Yisrael. This was something that was localized as a disease, limited to the Bnei Israel by God, kadei hazhiran, in order to caution them, limit them with the most difficult of challenges, and that is not to speak Lashon Hara. And he goes on to write that one who was involved and guilty of this negative trait of Lashon Hara, and here we are not talking about idle chatter Lashon Hara, but speech that causes ill and damage to others, then there was an immediate impact, firstly, upon the individual's house. The hope was that he or she would recognize and change their ways. If they continued, if the individual took ownership of their actions and ceased, then the Neged Tzaraat also was limited. If not, it then impacted upon the person's clothing. If the person still did not take ownership of his or her action, then the Neged Tzaraat broke out upon the body, resulting in banishment from the camp and total isolation until the symptoms of the Neged Tzaraat left the body. The link, as we noted in part 1, was drawn from a commandment in Devarim 24, Zachor et asher asa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam. Take note of the consequences of the Lashon Hara of Miriam. It was justifiable in that, according to Midrashic fill-ins, she was protecting the dignity of her sister-in-law, Moshe's wife, and nevertheless, she was struck down with the Neged Tzaraat. On this basis, the Rambam develops the cause and effect situation, beginning with the Neged Tzaraat of the buildings and ending with a Neged Tzaraat that afflicted the body. The solution posed by the Rambam to the Omek Hara of the Tzaraat is to take ownership of one's actions and undertake a process of serious introspection and teshuvah, which would of course go beyond the recitation of tefillot such as the Naleket, and also goes well beyond the lip service of merely saying I'm sorry. As I mentioned earlier in this panel, it is not for others to point the finger at one who is suffering from the Neged Tzaraat or its modern-day counterparts. This is a process that one must undertake on their own. It involves meditation and an acceptance of one's own wrongdoing, whatever it might be. Fortunately, I must note I have never been placed in that critical situation, and I certainly would not be the one to undertake victim blaming in a public forum. Is linking the Neged Tzaraat to God useful? I would argue to those who are at the end of their tether, who have gone through all the medical intervention, then having a God to turn to, real or imaginary, can be a source of comfort and hope. The modalities that we presently employ within Frum Judaism, Tehillim, a name change, and intensification of commitment to Torah mitzvot may or may not work, but at the very least do provide comfort in very difficult times. Where is the Riboy Hatov component of Neged Tzaraat? The Rebbe argued that in theory, based upon the Rambam, accepting responsibility for one's actions and undertaking a process of teshuvah is one option if applicable. the biblical period, there was an atonement process after the physical symptoms had been cleared from the body, which also, in theory at least, would have involved teshuvah. This is certainly not a one-size-fits-all explanation for why bad things happen to good people. The issue in of itself is far more complex in that it certainly doesn't explain the loss of innocent lives when a bomb decimates a bus, and it certainly does not explain the modern-day equivalent of a nega tzara for a baby born in the 21st week of its development. And this is where the grey area and the high tension, the anger resides. I conclude this panel once again with the disclaimer that this has been my view in attempting to understand the clash between the hashkafa positions presented within the texts and the translation of those hashkafa positions into the real world in which we live.